Hello and welcome to the video. This tale is titled Princess and Her Dog. This is the third part of a 6-part series. If you have missed the previous story, consider going back and watching The City of the Druids. If you enjoy this video, please leave a like or comment any feedback you have, and consider subscribing as there will be more tales to come. Princess Thalia awoke with a start, an involuntary cry escaping her lips. She breathed in deeply, wiping the sweat from her brow. Her surroundings were dark and foreign, but it seemed she was alone at least. Lifting herself into a sitting position, she looked about the small room. Slivers of light shone through the wooden slats that made up the small cabin, and she was vaguely aware that the room was rocking gently. Slowly, she began to remember where she was. So it wasn't a nightmare, after all, she thought, wringing her hands nervously. I stole that boat, ship, vessel, whatever this tub is called. She pulled the covers off and shifted her legs to the edge of the cot. Her father, King Ventus II, had been about to force her off to some mysterious college to learn magic, the last of many cruelties he had shown her. Her condition had gone unnoticed until now, but apparently she was a channeler. She could use magic. Even the High Channeler himself hadn't caught the signs. Usually, anyone with a hint of magical ability would be taken from their homes around the age of 11 or 12 and sent off to this ominous college. It was said that for the spark of magic to alight, you needed to be put through a traumatic experience. Thalia had barely left the palace grounds in her life so far, let alone been put through any trial or turmoil. At the end of the day, she was a princess of Arundel, and she had received the kind of sheltered childhood that befit her birth. Most of the common people in the kingdom experienced such harrowing ordeals on a daily basis. Princess Thalia had heard many stories about the dreaded college, none of them good, and so, the moment she had heard of her fate, she had snuck down to the docks and found a vessel prepared to set sail that very hour. Using the authority of her station, she had commanded the sailors and the ship's captain to wait on the docks as she released the mooring lines and let the boat drift into the bay. Getting to her feet, she stretched her back, then her neck. Thalia was a slender girl of 19, with jet black hair plaited in a thick braid that hung to her waist. She had cloud grey eyes that gleamed with a rich purple when sunlight fell upon them. She wore a light blue button-up shirt and taupe-coloured trousers. The shirt was intricately embroidered with gold thread that ran up her chest and over her shoulders. She realised as she stood that she had slept in her boots, the blackened leather still laced to her knees. Her stiff neck and back told her one thing: if she was going to spend any more nights in that cot, she would need to get someone to make it more comfortable for her. She had been waited on hand and foot for her entire life, and she wasn't ready to give up all the luxuries of royalty right away. Opening the cabin door, she was forced to cover her eyes as the sun's rays blinded her. Once her eyes had adjusted, she noted that the skies were completely clear, with not a wisp of cloud to be seen. She walked to the ship's railing and looked out over the sea. It was completely calm, with barely perceptible waves gingerly brushing up against the boat's hull. A pang of fear struck her when she realised she couldn't see the coast. She ran to the other side of the ship. Not a single patch of earth dotted the horizon, or anything for that matter. Feeling the panic start to rise in her, she turned around and found herself face to face with the biggest dog she'd ever seen. Thalia blinked in disbelief. The gigantic dog was sitting with its head cocked to one side and its large tongue dangling from its mouth. It had a heavy coat of light brown fur with large white spots, and its wrinkled face seemed unbelievably kind for an animal. Lucky her, she thought, as the dog was nearly up to her chin, sitting on its haunches, and its paws were bigger than her fists. "What are you doing here?" she asked the dog, whose reply was to cock its head to the other side. She sighed. "I don't have time to play with stupid animals or to contemplate where you've come from. There are more pressing matters at hand." Turning away from the dog, she walked up and down the deck multiple times, searching in vain for any sign of land. All the while, the dog loped behind her at a few meters distance. She stopped and looked up at the main mast and its rigging, which she hadn't noticed until now. The top two sails, mast and all their rigging, had snapped around the midway point and were dangling dangerously about 10 meters in the air above the deck. It looked like an oversized bird's nest of rope, tarp and splintered wood. "This is impossible. I couldn't have been out of the bay more than a few kilometers," I thought. "Even so, there are hundreds of little islands scattered off the west coast. I should be able to see something, at least, even if it weren't the mainland." The dog sat on its haunches in front of her again and tilted its head to one side. "Where do you think we are?" Taking this as a sign that she wanted to play, the dog bounced on its front paws, then put its elbows on the ground and lifted its behind into the air, tail wagging. She rolled her eyes and laughed despite herself at the dog's antics. Ridiculous furball. The princess never had any animals around the palace that she would have called her own, aside from a few horses. The servants that worked in the stables had always had stronger bonds with the animals than she. Even as a child, she hadn't kept an animal companion, as she was constantly around people, so she valued the brief periods where she could be in total solitude. However, she had to admit this enormous dog was rather cute. She walked over and patted the dog gently on the head, in the odd way that someone who has never patted a dog before would. The dog didn't seem to mind. "Let's see if we can find something to eat or drink, huh? I don't think we will be going anywhere with the mast the way it is." The dog woofed happily in answer, and the pair walked over to the stairs that led into the belly of the ship. It was dark inside, except for the gaps around the trapdoor at the top of the stairs, and a few of the warped planks in the decking, where shards of light shone through. There were an assortment of barrels, chests, and canvas-wrapped bundles littered across the confined space. She spent the next few hours going through everything she could prise open, but not a single thing could be eaten or drunk. Thalia had read countless books in the palace library, which probably had the biggest collection of books, tomes, and scrolls anywhere in the kingdom, so she had a rough idea of what she was looking at, despite not having seen most of the contents in person before. Inside the chests and barrels were tobacco leaves, raw parchment, inks of different colours, fabrics and skins, spices that she had never smelled, coal, and what looked like some sort of ore. Many of the crates were filled with cannonballs and black powder for the 20 or so cannons on board. It seemed a sizable haul for a trading vessel, but there was no food or water. "Well, that's going to complicate things for us, isn't it?" she asked the dog, who was currently sniffing a spice container and proceeded to sneeze loudly at the question. "We're also going to need to get those sails sorted out, otherwise we'll die of thirst. And I really don't feel like getting eaten by you once you're hungry, either." After climbing back up to the deck, the dog at her heels, the princess looked to the destroyed sails. She clasped her fingers worriedly. "As far as I know, we're going to need working sails to move the boat. I have read about ships using oars, but I don't see any of those around," she said. She stared at the tangled mess where it hung in midair, trying to trace the ropes back to their beginnings. If she could find a place to start, then maybe. She looked back down at the dog, the hope fading from her downcast eyes. "I think it's impossible. I can't see any way of getting that mess untangled, or even lowered down without breaking my neck. So, in the meantime, we'll just have to stay out from under it, okay? We don't want to get crushed," she muttered. The dog woofed in reply and ran around in circles, tracing around the dangerous area of the deck. As the pair wandered around the derelict ship, night began to fall. "Well, at least that's something normal," Thalia said, smiling as she pointed at the sun going down on the west side of the ship. The dog looked at her expectantly. "I think it's time for bed then. You will have to stay outside though. No dogs allowed in the bedroom." The dog's face looked so gloomy that she had to repeat herself. "No dogs in the bedroom. I mean it. I suggest you get below deck before it gets cold this evening." She closed the cabin door behind her and laid on the cot, wondering how it was possible to get so lost in the first place. She didn't know how long someone could go without water, but she knew it wasn't forever. Yawning, she tried to sleep, but her imagination ran wild. She tossed and turned, taking hours to fall asleep, only for her to wake with a start at daybreak. This time, she remembered the full nightmare. "It was the storm!" she shouted aloud. It was all coming back to her now. Her plan had been to sail south along the coastline to the kingdom of Kenan. Her older sister was married to the king there. She had known that if she travelled by horse, her father's men would have been on her before nightfall. But if she made her journey by ship, they would have a hard time indeed tracking her down. She knew her older sister wouldn't refuse her or turn her over to their father's men without good reason. Besides, she had read plenty of books about sailing. How hard could it be? She was sure she could handle it, especially if the ship was already prepared for a voyage and all the sails had been set for her. All she needed to do was sail down to Kenan Harbour and steer the ship in. She could swim to shore easily enough, if it came to it, or she could simply beach the ship somewhere accessible. It had seemed like the perfect plan until she had reached the mouth of the bay, and a tremendous storm had come out of nowhere. Black clouds had descended from the sky, and the ship had been rocked left and right. She remembered feeling as though she was falling. Then had come an awful wrenching sound, followed by a deafening crash as she had slammed into the deck and darkness had consumed her. Wiping away the moisture that had again gathered on her brow, Thalia arose and went out into the sunlight. The dog was lying just beyond the cabin. It lifted its head as she opened the door, and its fluffy tail began thumping the deck. As soon as she was through the door, the dog was at her side. She gave him a pat on the head, a bit more affectionately this time, feeling guilty that the dog had been waiting for her to get up. She paced up and down the deck, dog in tow. To her dismay, everything was the same as it had been the previous day. Clear skies, calm waters, and no land in sight. Adding to the odd situation was the fact that she didn't feel hungry or thirsty. It had been at least 24 hours, if not more. "Are you hungry? You don't look like you're about to eat me," she said. The dog gave a friendly yap in reply. She knelt and held the dog by the jowls, then went on. "I guess I should give you a name, since it seems we are going to be spending a little bit of time together, my furry friend." The dog sat on its haunches and looked at her with a regal tilt of its chin. "A very handsome pose. How about Brutus?" A loud woof and a nod sealed the deal. "Very well, Brutus. What are we going to do today?" A week passed. At first light, the cabin door burst open, and the princess threw a small hunk of rope out onto the deck. A blur of fur shot past her as the dog closed the distance from their now shared bed to the rope in 3 or 4 bounds. "That was the fastest yet, Brutus," Thalia exclaimed. The dog barked happily as he started to chew on the rope. "Today is the day. We are going to finally get that crow's nest down and our raft built. You're going to help me build this thing, right?" With 2 quick woofs, Brutus started to run in circles around the dangling wreckage. Thalia looked up at the nest where it was suspended in the air like a slaughtered cow. Wringing her hands, she stopped as Brutus came over to sit at her feet, and she began to stroke the top of his head, looking at the dog's face. With a nod, the princess spat on her hands and checked that the makeshift knife, made out of a bone they had found below deck, remained tucked into her belt. She took a deep breath and stepped toward the mast. She had never in her life dreamt of attempting something so dangerous, but began to climb all the same. Outside of horse riding, she hadn't done many physical activities, so the going was slow. She made it halfway up the wreckage when she looked down for the first time. With a shriek of terror, she hugged the mast as tightly as she could. Brutus began to bark encouragingly, which gave her the nerve to carry on. Once she had climbed high enough that she could look down on the wreckage, she was surprised to see only 3 ropes holding the mass in the air. That just made her job easier, she thought, as she reached out for the first tether. After what felt like hours of soaring, her arms were numb to the bone, but she had completely cut through one rope and was halfway through another. She leaned back onto the mast, letting the ropes she had tucked her feet into hold her up, and rested for quite some time. Looking down, she could still see Brutus running around and hear his woofs of motivation. I should have gotten you to do this for me. You never seem to run out of puff, do you? She called down. Finally catching her breath, she began again. Few things in her life had given her so much satisfaction as watching the dull knife fray more than cut through the ropes. She'd never felt so much determination. This time, when she cut through the second rope, the entire nest shuddered and swayed. "Okay, one more to go. You better get yourself out of harm's way, all right?" she shouted, and the dog obeyed. Brutus went to sit in front of the cabin door, far enough away that once the tangle of wood and rope came down, he would be safe. With one final effort, she stretched out and grabbed the last rope, being careful not to lose her balance. She had made it to the center of the thick rope when the fibers began to unwind. Suddenly, the entire thing dropped violently. The ship rocked with the motion, and Thalia overbalanced, shrieking as she lost her footing and fell. Dropping the knife, she caught herself on the swinging nest with both hands. Hearing her screams, Brutus ran over barking. "Don't worry, I've got a good hold. If I can just—" With that last word, her hold gave way. She fell the remaining distance. Thankfully, she fell onto something soft. Brutus had put his body right under hers, and she had landed on top of him, cushioning the blow. "I can't believe you caught me. You really are the best dog. I don't know what I would have done without you." With an affectionate grumble, the dog nuzzled up to her, and she gave him a big hug. After a few heartbeats, he stood back and struck his royal pose. At that very moment, the final fibre holding the nest aloft snapped with a savage twang. The top of the mainmast, 2 massive sails, and about 1 kilometre of heavy rope came crashing down, right where the dog was standing. "No!" Thalia cried, and without thinking, both her arms shot out, as if they had a mind of their own. The giant crow's nest was floating 1/2 metre above the now cowering dog. Straining like she never had before, and with disbelief on her face, Thalia held the broken wood and rope aloft without so much as touching it. With tremendous effort, she shifted her arms over to the right, and the ball of chaos followed. Some of the ropes tangled themselves around 2 of the cannons, and they were dragged out of position. When the nest was hanging over the ship's railing above the sea, and she felt like she couldn't take it anymore, she loosened the tension in her arms. The ball plummeted into the sea with a tremendous splash, dragging the 2 cannons overboard and smashing a section of the railing to pieces. "It probably would have floated if it weren't for those cannons. I should have just laid it down on the deck. What was I thinking?" she exclaimed with frustration, as Brutus whined sympathetically. She didn't have time to take in the fact that she had just used magic. The last piece of rope that was attached to the sunken mass slithered along the deck as it was pulled overboard. A split second later, the rope had wrapped itself around the dog's back left paw. The princess screamed, "Look out, you're—" But it was too late. The dog was yanked across the deck and over the edge of the ship. She heard the splash as the dog hit the water. Without hesitation, she dived in after him. Swimming with all her might, she only just managed to catch up to the quickly sinking dog. She tugged and tugged to try and get Brutus's paw free, but he was thrashing around, which only seemed to make things worse. Without thinking, she grabbed his head and held it close to her own. Incredibly, this pacified him and he stopped resisting. She untangled his foot as their surroundings began to grow dark. Thalia hugged Brutus to her chest and looked up. She didn't realize they had been sinking so fast. She began to kick upwards to the surface with all her might, with the weight of the large dog hindering her progress. She could see rays of sunlight through the water, yet they were still so far from the surface, they weren't going to make it. Her vision tunneled and her body begged her to take a breath. She looked at Brutus, who was staring into her eyes. There was nothing she could do now, so she gave in, opening her mouth to take one final breath. As the water filled her throat, her vision narrowed to a point and darkness took her. Thalia awoke with a jolt. Across the small cabin, Brutus startled awake, before bounding over to where the princess lay. "What the hell? Why?" Panting, she stared at the dog she had thought dead, as he came over and put his head on her lap. "What are we gonna do?" she said, and began to sob into the dog's fur as he uttered a solemn howl.
"So everything went according to plan, yes?"
King Ventus said to the High Channeler.
"Why, yes, my lord. Better than I could have imagined. There was a bit of a bump getting the ship into the sphere, but apart from that, it's a beautiful piece of magic if you ask me,"
the High Channeler replied. The pair bent forward to peer into the glass sphere sitting on the Channeler's desk. It was half filled with water, and in the center sat a tiny ship with a broken mast. The High Channeler looked up at the king and continued.
"She cannot be harmed, and she will not grow hungry or thirsty. After a short time has passed, and she has grown to care for the dog, we simply have someone kill it. I'm sure her magical abilities will be brought right to the surface. It was a brilliant plan, sire. Simply perfect."
Leaning back contentedly, the king said,
"Splendid. Please come and see me when you think it's time."
The king turned around and left the room, closing the door behind him. The end.
This was a Tello Tale. Thanks for watching.